My name's Lynn Jordan, and I live in Main Street in Ravenstone, and I'm here to talk about my grandparents and life at number 28 Main Street. In those days, it wasn't 28 Main Street. The houses were not numbered. And I think people gave numbering themselves to their homes, and it started from the opposite end of the street. So we were number 7. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was born George Collier Marsden, and he lived in Church Lane. His birth certificate says that he was born in Heroes Row. Don't know where it is. I've asked lots of people and looked at records, but I believe it's on Church Lane because the 2011 census gives his address as Church Lane, living with his parents and 3 other brothers. He worked primarily at the mines, but he also did some work at Ravenstone Hall in the garden. And I'll come on to this later, but that's how he met his wife. I have very, very faint memories of him. He died when I was 4, and I remember him as rather a grumpy old man. I don't think he really liked having to take me out for walks because I was probably not a very well-behaved child. But he was a member of the Ancient Order of Druids, which was, I think, a sick club, rather like the Oddfellows. And the Druids met in the reading room, which was where the bungalow is now, next door to our house. That bungalow was built in 1959 by George Watson, but prior to that, Miss Fosbrook from Ravenstone Hall owned the cottage and the adjoining reading room. There's a photograph on one of the old Ravenstone village calendars of the Druids marching past Ravenstone, past the plough inn at Ravenstone. So that was George, and he had 4 brothers. There were no sisters. 2 of them had no children, and they all lived in Church Lane. I think they moved from one house to another in Church Lane. Then he met my grandmother. He was, I believe, 6 years younger than her. But her date of birth varies depending on the documentation. Her birth certificate says that she was born Beatrice May Coles at the village of Little Harrowden in Northamptonshire in 1877. But by the time of her marriage in 1908, she'd lost 6 years. She was the daughter of a family of bakers and farmers, and she was rather a sickly child. Her 2 elder sisters had both, I think they were quite a lot older than her, and they had both trained as nurses, one of them at Guy's Hospital, where she became a nursing sister. And my grandmother wanted to become a nurse too, but she'd had rheumatic fever as a child and she was thought not to be strong enough. But that didn't prevent her being sent to London at the age of 10 to train as a cook. And we still have some letters which were sent to her by the local reverend expressing concern about her health. But she trained as a cook, and she worked in various large houses in London. And then one day, a friend wrote to her telling her of a vacancy for a cook at Ravenstone Hall. So I think she would have been in her late teens, possibly 20, when she came to live at Ravenstone Hall, and that's where she met my grandfather. So they were married in 1908, and a year later, the first of 5 children arrived. So there were 3 brothers, then my mother, and then a 4th brother. Shortly after their marriage, they went to live at the house in Main Street, and initially they rented it. They rented it from Mary Cresswell, who lived in what's now the White House in Main Street. The Cresswells and the Fosbrooks were the 2 big landowning families in Ravenstone. They rented the larger of the 2 adjoining cottages, and then in about 1919, 1920, they bought the 2 cottages. They rented out the smaller one, and my mother and her brothers were brought up in the larger one. I say the larger one, but there were only 2 bedrooms. So they built a partition to make a small bedroom for my mother because she was the only girl, and the boys were brought up there. My grandmother, I remember being a very quiet, gentle sort of person. The boys, my uncles, I was very fond of. My mother tells stories of how they used to have their bicycles hanging around the wall of what used to be a little stable at the back of the cottage, and they would sit on the floor and they would play cards together. And as my grandparents got older, they moved to live in the smaller of the 2 cottages, and my parents, who had married in 1939, after my father came out of the army, they came to live in the larger cottage, and my mum looked after my grandparents. They both died in the mid-50s, my grandfather in 55 and my grandmother in 56. But my grandmother went to the WI in the village and came to church here